Kit Carson stood at the edge of the Rocky Mountains, the vast frontier stretching before him. This was the land he knew, the land that had shaped him into the man he was. Born in Kentucky and raised in Missouri, Carson had never known anything but the wild, the untamed frontier. His early life had been filled with loss and hardship, losing his parents at a young age, but the wilderness had become his true home. By the time he was a young man, he had learned to hunt, trap, and survive in the vast expanse of the West. Now, as a guide for settlers, he had one goal: to push further into the unknown. The American West beckoned with promises of discovery, yet Carson knew it was also a place of danger. The land was beautiful but treacherous, and its inhabitants, whether settlers or Native Americans, were often unforgiving. In this chapter, Carson reflects on his journey, his experiences with different tribes, and his growing sense of purpose. He wasn't just guiding others, he was discovering something deeper about himself and the land he traversed. The trail grew lonely as Carson ventured further into the wilderness, his only companions the landscape and his horse. One evening, as he set up camp near a secluded river, he noticed a figure moving silently through the trees. It was a Native American warrior, his posture both regal and cautious. The warrior approached, eyes fixed on Carson. "What brings you here, pale man?" the warrior asked, his voice low and controlled. Carson did not flinch. He had encountered many tribes in his travels, some friendly, others hostile. "I come to guide, not to take," he said, his words heavy with meaning. The warrior studied him for a long moment, his face unreadable. In that silence, the weight of history pressed upon them. Two men from opposite worlds meeting in the heart of a land that was neither fully theirs. The warrior finally nodded and disappeared into the night, but Carson's thoughts lingered on the exchange. The encounter mirrored the broader conflict of the West, the clash between settlers seeking land and tribes fighting to protect it. Carson continued his journey with a group of settlers, leading them toward the Oregon Territory. As they crossed a high mountain pass, dark clouds gathered ominously overhead. Before anyone could react, a powerful snowstorm descended upon them. The settlers, unaccustomed to such harsh conditions, began to panic. Carson, however, remained calm. He knew the wilderness was unpredictable, but he had survived worse. The storm raged, visibility nearly zero. Carson's heart raced, not with fear, but with the sharp instinct he had honed over years of navigating dangerous terrain. He ordered the settlers to stay close, keep moving, and trust in his experience. They were at the mercy of nature, and Carson knew that the key to survival lay in perseverance. Hours passed as they trudged through the snow, the cold biting at their skin. Carson, sensing that the storm could last for days, knew they had to find shelter before it was too late. Exhaustion began to take its toll on the settlers. With the storm showing no signs of letting up, doubts crept into their minds. Some of them wanted to stop, to wait out the storm in the open, while others argued for pressing on. Carson faced the difficult decision of whether to continue through the storm or take shelter and risk being stranded without a plan. He knew that time was running out. To stop meant freezing in the open. To continue meant pushing the settlers to their physical limits. But Carson had led men through worse. "We press on," he said firmly. "We move together, or we perish alone." His words were met with grumbles, but they followed. Carson's decision was driven by years of experience in the wilderness, where giving up could be a death sentence. As they fought through the storm, Carson's resolve began to earn their respect. The settlers' initial doubts began to fade, replaced by the realization that Carson was more than a guide. He was their lifeline. After hours of navigating the blizzard, Carson's sharp senses detected something faint, smoke in the distance. His heart leapt as he urged the settlers forward. The storm was relentless, but his instincts told him they were close to safety. They soon arrived at a small log cabin nestled in a valley, the smoke from its chimney a beacon of hope in the midst of the storm. The settlers staggered inside, grateful for the warmth and shelter the cabin offered. As they huddled around the fire, Carson's mind remained focused on the future. This was a temporary refuge, and the journey was far from over. The settlers were safe, for now, But Carson understood that the West was an ever-changing landscape of dangers. This brief moment of relief was just that, a moment. The storm outside continued to rage, and Carson found himself alone in the quiet cabin. His thoughts turned inward as he reflected on the land that had shaped him. The West was a place of harsh beauty, but also of conflict. He remembered the faces of the Native Americans he had met, some who had welcomed him with open arms, others who had viewed him as an invader. In particular, he recalled a past encounter with a Navajo who had initially been suspicious of his presence. Over time, however, he had come to understand their way of life and had developed a mutual respect. Yet, he also knew that this respect did not erase the tension between settlers and tribes, a tension that would only grow as more people moved west. As Carson stared into the flickering fire, he realized that the land he had come to love had also become a battleground, one where survival, both for him and for the tribes, was constantly at stake. The next day, the group pressed forward, and Carson was sent ahead to scout the trail. As he rode through the dense forest, he stumbled upon a gruesome sight, a group of U.S. Army scouts, ambushed and left for dead. Carson knew this wasn't the work of Native Americans. Something else was at play. With his sharp survival instincts, Carson quickly determined that the attackers were rogue settlers, men who had become outlaws, driven by greed and desperation. The frontier, for all its promises of opportunity, also bred violence and lawlessness. Carson faced a difficult choice. Should he pursue these men and risk angering the lawless factions of the West, or should he let them go and continue his mission? His duty was to protect the settlers, but he couldn't ignore the lawless element threatening the very fabric of the frontier. Carson tracked the outlaws for days, knowing they were dangerous and ruthless. Yet, when he finally cornered them, he found himself at a crossroads. The men pleaded for their lives, promising to leave the settlers alone if given a chance to escape. Carson's decision wasn't easy. In the wilderness, there were no clear answers, only hard choices. With a heavy heart, Carson allowed the men to leave, knowing that he could not solve every problem with violence. However, he also understood that the West was a place where every man made his own rules, and those rules were often brutal. This part examines Carson's internal struggle. He was a man of honor, but honor in the West could sometimes be a fluid concept. His decision to let the outlaws go was based on pragmatism, knowing that the wild was unpredictable and survival often depended on such decisions. The journey wore on, and the settlers began to feel the strain. The endless stretch of the wilderness was unforgiving, and their hopes began to wane. Carson's leadership was increasingly tested. The settlers questioned whether the land they sought was worth the price they were paying in lives and spirit. Carson, too, began to question his place in the grand scheme of things. He had led them this far, but was it enough? Every decision seemed to weigh more heavily. Every step forward felt like a step into the unknown. He had become more than just a guide. He was now their protector, their connection to survival in a land that could destroy them without hesitation. Finally, after months of peril, Carson and the settlers reached the edge of the Oregon Territory. They had survived the dangers of the wild, but Carson could not shake the feeling of emptiness. They had conquered the land, but at what cost? The West would never truly be conquered. It would always remain wild, unpredictable, and, in its own way, free. As Carson stood on the edge of the land he had crossed countless times, he realized that his place in history was not as a conqueror, but as a witness. He had seen the land in all its beauty and brutality, and he had survived it. His legacy would not be one of domination, but of coexistence between man and land, settlers and Native Americans. In the end, Kit Carson's legacy was that of a guide, a man who understood the land, respected its dangers, and survived its trials. He would never be fully part of the land, but the land had shaped him into the man who would lead others across its vast, untamed expanse. Kit Carson's story became a part of the American frontier legend. Though his life was filled with hardship, survival, and conflict, it was ultimately defined by his respect for the land and its people. The West was a place of dreams, but also nightmares, and Carson, the humble frontiersman, was one of its most enduring figures.